The first scream came before anyone realized the airplane was falling. It wasn't loud, just one terrified gasp from a woman in seat 2A as her coffee floated weightlessly into the air. Half a second later, the aircraft dropped, not gently, violently. Flight 728 plunged through a pocket of brutal turbulence, so suddenly that every unsecured object inside the cabin launched toward the ceiling. Suitcases burst from overhead bins. Plastic cups exploded across the aisle. A baby cried. Someone shouted a prayer. The seatbelt warning chimed frantically as the enormous Boeing 787 shuddered against the storm clouds over Lake Michigan. For one impossible moment, it felt as though the sky itself had broken apart. Natalie Ross had experienced turbulence before. In 9 years as a senior flight attendant, she had handled engine failures, medical emergencies, bird strikes, even one emergency landing. But this felt different. The aircraft groaned beneath her feet. The wings flexed violently outside the windows. Lightning illuminated the cabin in cold white flashes. Yet Natalie never screamed. She smiled, the same reassuring smile she'd perfected after thousands of flights. "It's okay," she called calmly while gripping the overhead compartment. "Everyone, keep your seatbelts fastened. We're going to be all right." She wasn't sure she believed herself, but panic spread faster than fear. And her job wasn't to be fearless. It was to make everyone else believe there was nothing to fear. Another violent jolt threw her sideways. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," his breathing sounded heavier than usual. "We've encountered unexpected severe weather. We'll be making an emergency landing at Chicago Executive Airport." A murmur swept through the cabin. Emergency landing. Passengers knew what those words meant. Children began crying louder. Several people reached for loved ones. Natalie immediately moved through first class, checking every seatbelt despite the aircraft continuing to shake beneath her. One elderly man grabbed her wrist. "Miss, are we going to die?" Natalie gently squeezed his hand. "Not today." He smiled weakly. She wished confidence alone could change reality. Rain slammed against the cockpit windows like handfuls of gravel. Outside, the city below disappeared beneath black clouds. Inside, cabin lights flickered. Emergency floor lights illuminated. The smell of overheated electronics drifted faintly through the air. Natalie noticed it immediately. Years of training had sharpened instincts ordinary passengers never developed. Something wasn't right. The turbulence alone didn't explain that smell. The aircraft descended sharply. Runway lights finally pierced the darkness below. The wheels slammed onto wet pavement. Rubber screamed. Passengers cheered too early. A second later, the plane skidded sideways. Luggage crashed forward. The left engine roared violently. Metal scraped against concrete. Natalie's shoulder slammed into a service cart. The entire cabin filled with smoke from burned rubber. Finally, after what felt like forever, the aircraft stopped. Silence. No one moved. Then applause erupted. Some passengers cried. Others laughed through relief. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. Another safe landing, or so she thought, as emergency crews rushed toward the aircraft. The captain's voice came again. "We've experienced a hydraulic failure. Ground inspection will take approximately 90 minutes. Please remain on board. Groans echoed throughout the cabin. Delayed. Again. Natalie smiled politely. We'll begin serving refreshments shortly. Normal. Routine. Normal procedures. Keep everyone calm. She grabbed the galley inventory list, then noticed something strange. One catering compartment hadn't been sealed correctly before departure. She frowned. That compartment had been locked during takeoff. Slowly, she opened it. Nothing. Just blankets, medical supplies, emergency equipment. She closed it again. Then, a quiet sound stopped her. Someone breathing. Very slowly. Very painfully. Natalie's heartbeat quickened. She looked toward the narrow storage area behind the first-class galley. Impossible. No passenger should be there. She pulled the curtain aside and froze. A man lay collapsed between emergency supply containers. His white dress shirt was soaked with blood. One hand pressed against a gunshot wound beneath his ribs. The other still gripped a black pistol. He looked up the instant their eyes met. Steel gray eyes, cold, focused, dangerously alert, despite obvious blood loss. Without speaking, he slowly raised the pistol, not directly at her, just enough to warn her. Natalie couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed to run, to call airport security, to alert the captain. Instead, she noticed something unexpected. He was trying not to lose consciousness. His breathing had become uneven. His face had turned pale beneath the cabin lights. He wasn't threatening her. He was surviving. Their silence lasted several seconds. Finally, he spoke. His voice remained calm, despite the pain. "You're deciding whether to save me." Natalie stared at the blood spreading across the floor. "You shouldn't even be here." "No, I shouldn't. You need a hospital." "I can't go." She frowned. "Why?" For the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. Not fear of dying. Fear of something worse. "If they find me," he glanced toward the passenger cabin, "everyone on this plane dies." Natalie instinctively looked back through the curtain. Families, business, travelers, children, coloring quietly, an elderly couple sharing sandwiches. Completely ordinary people. Then she looked back at him. "What are you talking about?" His breathing grew heavier. "They're already on board." "Who?" He answered almost too quietly to hear. "The men who came to finish what they started." Before Natalie could ask another question, a voice echoed from first class. "Excuse me." A sharply dressed businessman stood near the galley entrance. "Flight attendant? I think someone left blood in the aisle." Natalie's heart stopped. She looked down. A thin trail of fresh blood had begun flowing beneath the storage compartment door, straight into the passenger cabin, and someone was already walking toward it. The businessman stopped only a few feet from the galley. His polished leather shoes paused beside the thin ribbon of blood slowly creeping across the cabin floor. Passengers nearby turned their heads. One little boy frowned. "Mommy, what's that?" Natalie's pulse thundered inside her ears. She forced herself to smile. Without hesitating, she stepped directly into the aisle, placing her foot over the blood before anyone else could notice where it originated. "Oh, that?" She laughed lightly. "I accidentally spilled some cranberry juice while restocking." She lifted a folded towel from the service cart and knelt, quickly wiping away every trace of red before anyone questioned it further. The businessman didn't seem convinced. It doesn't look like cranberry juice. Natalie looked up, maintaining steady eye contact. Our supplier changed brands this week. It's surprisingly realistic. A few nearby passengers chuckled. The businessman shrugged and returned to his seat. Only when his back disappeared into first class did Natalie finally exhale. She had bought herself perhaps 30 seconds. No more. She slipped behind the galley curtain again. The wounded stranger had become noticeably weaker. Blood continued soaking through his white shirt despite the pressure he applied to the wound. Natalie immediately reached for the emergency medical kit. He caught her wrist before she could open it. No, you'll call attention. You'll bleed to death. I've survived worse. She looked directly into his eyes. No, you've survived until now. She carefully removed his hand from the wound. The bleeding was worse than she expected. The bullet had entered just below the ribs. Not immediately fatal, but if untreated, he would not survive another hour. I'm calling airport paramedics. You can't. I don't have a choice. You do. His voice remained calm. If anyone in uniform boards this aircraft before we know who's hunting me, they'll never leave alive. Natalie stared at him. What kind of people are after you? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her face, almost as if deciding whether she deserved the truth. Finally, he spoke. They don't kill witnesses. They kill cities. The words settled heavily between them. Natalie wasn't sure whether to believe him. Yet, something in his expression refused to feel exaggerated. He wasn't trying to frighten her. He was warning her. Carefully, she disinfected the wound. He never flinched. Not once. Most grown men screamed during emergency treatment. This man barely blinked. Only the tightening of his jaw betrayed the pain. You've done this before. She glanced up. I'm a flight attendant. Basic emergency medicine is part of our training. No, you've treated gunshot wounds before. Natalie paused. My father was an army medic. He taught me enough to keep someone alive. The stranger gave the smallest nod. He taught you well. She wrapped a pressure bandage around his torso. Only then did she notice something unusual. Scars. Old ones. Knife wounds. Bullet wounds. Surgical scars crossing his shoulder. This wasn't someone caught in one bad night. This was a man who had spent years surviving wars. What happened to you? He looked toward the cabin. I made a mistake. Natalie almost smiled. Getting shot? No. Trusting someone. A sudden announcement interrupted them. Ladies and gentlemen, due to runway inspections, will remain on board for approximately 2 more hours. Groans filled the cabin again. Natalie looked toward the ceiling. 2 hours. He wouldn't survive 2 hours without proper treatment. She opened another compartment. Blankets, saline, oxygen, enough supplies to stabilize him. Barely. As she worked, he watched her carefully. You haven't asked my name. You haven't told me. Would it matter? She tightened another bandage. If you're bleeding in my aircraft, it matters. A faint smile appeared for the first time. My name is Matteo. She repeated it softly. Matteo. The name somehow suited him. Strong, controlled, dangerous. She still had no idea just how dangerous. Meanwhile, In seat 4C, a man wearing a charcoal gray business suit quietly folded his newspaper. He had boarded the aircraft in New York. No checked luggage. No carry-on. Paid cash. Never removed his gloves. No one remembered seeing him smile. He glanced toward the galley. His eyes paused briefly on the floor. The blood trail had disappeared. Interesting. Very interesting. He reached into his jacket pocket. Inside, a tiny encrypted satellite phone vibrated silently. One message appeared. Target confirmed. Do not let the aircraft depart. He deleted it immediately, then looked toward the smiling flight attendant. She had become involved. That complicated things. Back inside the galley, Natalie finished dressing the wound. Matteo finally leaned back against the storage wall. His breathing had stabilized. For now, she handed him a bottle of water. You owe me an explanation. I do. You said everyone on board is in danger. They are. Why? He remained silent, almost reluctant. Then, he reached slowly into the inside pocket of his blood-stained jacket. Natalie instinctively tensed. Instead of another weapon, he removed a slim black flash drive. No label, no markings, just black metal. He placed it carefully into her hand. It contains enough evidence to destroy every major mafia family operating in North America. Natalie's eyes widened. He continued, and enough evidence to expose several politicians, judges, federal agents, and people who believe they're untouchable. She stared at the tiny device. This is why they're hunting you? No, they're hunting everyone who might protect it. Her hands suddenly felt cold. She realized something terrifying. By touching that flash drive, by helping him, she had unknowingly crossed a line. There would be no returning to normal life after today. She handed it back immediately. I don't want this. You already have it. What? He nodded toward her apron. She looked down. Without noticing, she had instinctively slipped the flash drive into her uniform pocket while treating him. Someone watching from outside would assume she now possessed it. Her stomach tightened. You did that on purpose. No, I needed both hands. But fate has a strange sense of humor. She almost laughed despite herself. This isn't funny. I know. Before either of them could speak again, the cockpit door opened. Captain Henry Collins stepped into the galley. Natalie, we need to discuss something. His expression seemed unusually tense. He lowered his voice. Airport security wants permission to board. Natalie's heart skipped. She glanced briefly toward Matteo behind the curtain. The captain noticed. What are you looking at? For the first time all evening, Natalie hesitated, and the captain saw it. A single second of uncertainty, enough to make him suspicious. Before she could answer, a loud metallic bang echoed beneath the aircraft. The entire cabin shook. Passengers screamed again. The lights flickered violently. Emergency alarms began flashing red throughout the cabin. A mechanic's voice crackled frantically over the intercom from the ground. Captain, someone just sabotaged the landing gear. Silence consumed the aircraft. Then another voice came through, one that wasn't from the airport. Cold, distorted, broadcast across every cabin speaker. Nobody leaves the plane until Matteo DeLuca is dead. The passengers looked at one another in horror. Natalie slowly turned back toward the wounded stranger behind the curtain. He closed his eyes, not in fear, in resignation. Finally, he whispered the truth she had been dreading. I told you. They were already on board. For 3 long seconds, no one inside the aircraft moved. The distorted voice had disappeared. Only the flashing emergency lights remained, bathing the cabin in alternating shades of crimson and white. Then, chaos exploded. What did he say? Who's Matteo DeLuca? Is this some kind of joke? A child burst into tears. Several passengers immediately stood, despite repeated warnings. One man rushed toward the emergency exit before another flight attendant stopped him. You can't open that door. Someone just said they're going to kill us. The cabin instantly dissolved into fear. Natalie had spent nearly a decade calming frightened passengers. She had never seen panic spread this quickly. Because this time, everyone had heard the threat. Captain Henry Collins grabbed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are working closely with airport authorities. There is no immediate danger. Even he didn't sound convinced. His voice trembled ever so slightly. Natalie noticed. So did Matteo. Hidden behind the galley curtain, he whispered. He already knows. Natalie looked back. Knows what? The captain isn't afraid of the announcement. He's afraid of who's outside. Airport floodlights illuminated the rain-soaked runway. Dozens of police cruisers surrounded the aircraft. Fire trucks stood ready. Ambulances waited, yet none of them approached. They simply watched. Matteo frowned. They're waiting. For what? For permission. Natalie stared at him. Permission from who? He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stood for the first time. Pain immediately crossed his face. Fresh blood soaked through the bandage. Still, he remained remarkably steady. Years of violence had taught his body to ignore suffering. Natalie instinctively reached for his arm. You shouldn't be standing. I don't have a choice. You'll reopen the wound. He looked directly into her eyes. If I'm right, we have less than 15 minutes. Before she could ask why, the cockpit intercom buzzed again, not from outside, from inside the aircraft. Someone had accessed the internal communication system. A calm male voice echoed through every speaker. Good evening. My name doesn't matter. I'm only here for one man. If Matteo DeLuca surrenders voluntarily, everyone else lives. Silence. Then the voice continued. If he refuses, this aircraft becomes his coffin. The transmission ended. Passengers immediately began shouting, Who is Matteo? Where is he? Search the plane. Within seconds, several frightened travelers began looking beneath seats and inside overhead compartments. Fear had transformed ordinary people into desperate investigators. Natalie's stomach tightened. It wouldn't take long before someone reached the galley. Matteo quietly removed his blood-stained jacket. Beneath it, he wore a fitted black compression shirt, soaked crimson around his ribs. He looked toward Natalie. I need your help. She almost laughed. I've already helped far more than I should. You've barely begun. What does that mean? He nodded toward the passenger cabin. There are at least 3 assassins on board. She stared. 3? Possibly 4. How could you possibly know? I know how Victor Moretti works. The name meant nothing to Natalie, but Matteo spoke it with unmistakable certainty. He never sends one killer. He sends enough to guarantee success. Natalie folded her arms. You keep talking as if this is normal. For you, it is. You don't seem surprised people want you dead. Matteo looked away briefly. I stopped being surprised years ago. His voice carried no self-pity, only exhaustion. For the first time, Natalie realized something. He wasn't simply dangerous. He was tired. Tired of surviving. Tired of losing people. Tired of never knowing whether each sunrise would be his last. A loud crash echoed from economy class. Someone screamed. Natalie rushed into the aisle. A middle-aged passenger had collapsed beside row 18. People crowded around him. My husband, please. He can't breathe. Training immediately overpowered fear. Natalie knelt beside him, pulse rapid, sweating heavily, chest pain. Likely a panic-induced cardiac episode. She grabbed the emergency oxygen kit. Everyone give him space. As passengers stepped back, she noticed something. A young man wearing headphones, perfectly calm, too calm, while everyone else panicked. He watched, not the patient, not Natalie, the galley, the exact place Matteo was hiding. Their eyes met briefly. He smiled, barely, then looked away. Natalie's instincts screamed. Something about him felt wrong. She returned behind the curtain. I think I found one. Matteo didn't ask who. Instead, what seat? 21A. He closed his eyes. The headphones? She nodded slowly. Dark gray hoodie? Yes. No wedding ring? Yes. Left-handed? Natalie's heartbeat quickened. How do you know? Matteo answered quietly. Because I've seen him before. He works for Moretti. Natalie looked through a tiny gap in the curtain. Seat 21A. The young man calmly reading an airline magazine. Looking completely ordinary. Impossible. He looks normal. Matteo almost smiled. The dangerous ones always do. Another announcement interrupted them. This one from Air Traffic Control, Flight 728. You are instructed to remain sealed. No personnel will board until further notice. Captain Collins frowned. This is ridiculous. Natalie noticed something unusual. The captain muted the radio, then immediately reached for his personal cell phone. He walked into the cockpit, closed the door, locked it. Matteo watched silently. He shouldn't have done that. Why? The tower recordings become official evidence. Private phones don't. Natalie suddenly understood. The captain was hiding something. Minutes later, Captain Collins emerged. His face had changed. He forced a reassuring smile. We've received updated instructions. The airport requests all passengers remain calm. We'll begin disembarkation shortly. Matteo whispered. He's lying. How do you know? Look outside. Natalie did. Every emergency vehicle had disappeared. Only darkness remained beyond the runway. The aircraft stood completely alone. Then, the cabin lights went out. Absolute darkness. Children screamed. Emergency floor lights activated. Tiny blue lights traced the aisle. Natalie heard something. Footsteps. Not running. Walking. Slowly. Confidently. Somewhere inside the aircraft. Not one person. Several. Moving in different directions simultaneously. Matteo reached inside his ankle holster. Natalie's eyes widened. A second gun? I told you. I came prepared. She whispered. You can't start shooting inside an airplane. He looked toward the dark cabin. If they find lilies. He stopped himself. Wrong story. He corrected immediately. If they find me first. There won't be an airplane left to protect. Natalie stared at him. What are we supposed to do? For the first time, Matteo reached for her hand. Not romantically. Not possessively. Simply because he wanted her attention. His voice became almost inaudible. We stop hiding. She frowned. What? They expect me to run. So? We're going hunting. At that exact moment, a single suppressed gunshot echoed from the rear of the aircraft. Then, another. A flight attendant screamed. The intercom suddenly crackled back to life. The distorted voice returned. One sentence. Cold. Patient. Almost amused. One of my men has already found you, Matteo. But which one? Even I won't tell you. The scream came from the rear galley. Sharp. Terrified. Then silence. Natalie's heart lurched. She instinctively stepped toward the aisle. But Matteo caught her wrist. Don't. A crew member is hurt. I know. I have to help. So do I. She tried to pull away. My responsibility is every passenger on this airplane. Matteo's steel gray eyes locked onto hers. And mine is making sure you stay alive long enough to save them. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The world beyond the galley dissolved into darkness and panic. Natalie realized something unsettling. Only minutes ago, Matteo had been a wounded stranger. Now, he was standing between her and death without hesitation. The emergency lights cast long blue shadows across the cabin. Passengers huddled together, whispering frantically. Children clung to their parents. Phones had no signal. The satellite internet had mysteriously stopped working. The aircraft had become an isolated island. Nobody could call for help. Nobody even knew what was happening. Natalie slowly stepped into the aisle. We have to calm them. Matteo nodded once. But first, he looked toward row 21. The headphones. The seat was empty. Natalie's stomach tightened. He moved. No. Matteo scanned the cabin carefully. He disappeared. Another crew member hurried toward them. It was Emily Sanders, one of the junior flight attendants. She looked pale. Natalie. There was blood in the rear galley. Whose? I don't know. The lights went out. When they came back, Michael was gone. Michael, the senior purser. He had vanished without anyone seeing him leave. Natalie looked at Matteo. This isn't random. He nodded. They're separating the crew. Why? So nobody trusts anyone. Matteo walked slowly toward first class. Every movement caused fresh blood to seep through his bandage. Natalie noticed. You're bleeding again. I'll survive. You keep saying that. I keep proving it. Despite everything. She almost smiled. His calmness was infuriating, yet strangely reassuring. They reached the empty business class cabin. Matteo crouched beside seat 3F. His fingers brushed across the carpet. Blood. Fresh. Then, he picked up something tiny. A silver earpiece. Professional military communication equipment. Not commercially available. He handed it to Natalie. Airport security doesn't use these. Who does? Private contractors. She frowned. You mean mercenaries? The expensive kind. Suddenly, a quiet voice came from behind them. You found it. Natalie spun around. Captain Henry Collins stood at the end of the aisle. His hands remained visible, his expression calm, too calm. Matteo slowly stood. "You've been working with Moretti." The captain sighed. "I was hoping you'd figure it out later." Natalie stared between them. "What?" Captain Collins looked genuinely disappointed. "I liked you, Miss Ross. You were kind. You deserved a better flight." Natalie's voice trembled. "You're helping them?" He smiled sadly. "I'm helping my family." He reached slowly into his jacket. Natalie's heart stopped. Instead of a weapon, he removed a photograph. A little girl, perhaps 8 years old, smiling. "Hospital bill. Cancer." Captain Collins looked down at it. "My daughter needed treatment. They offered to pay. They didn't tell me innocent people would die." Matteo answered quietly. "They never do." The captain looked exhausted. "I sabotaged the landing. I delayed airport security. I disabled communications. But," he swallowed hard, "I didn't know they intended to kill everyone." Natalie whispered, "Then help us." He closed his eyes. "I can't. They still have my daughter." The silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Matteo stepped closer. "You still have a choice." The captain laughed bitterly. "No, I lost that months ago." He pulled a small electronic device from his pocket. Natalie frowned. "What is that?" "A cabin access transmitter." Matteo's expression hardened. "Drop it." "Too late." The captain pressed the button. A loud metallic click echoed beneath the aircraft. Cargo hatch unlocked. Matteo cursed under his breath. They're inside. At that exact moment, the rear cargo door exploded inward. Cold winter air rushed through the aircraft. 3 masked gunmen climbed into the cargo compartment. Silenced rifles, night vision goggles, military precision. Passengers began screaming again. Natalie instinctively ran toward the children seated near the emergency exits. Matteo intercepted the first attacker before he reached the aisle. The fight happened so quickly, it barely seemed real. One precise strike. The rifle fell. A second movement. The assassin collapsed unconscious. No wasted motion. No unnecessary violence. Years of brutal training condensed into seconds. Natalie watched in disbelief. He wasn't fighting out of anger. He fought like a man who desperately wanted every battle to end quickly. The second attacker opened fire. Bullets shattered overhead compartments. Passengers dropped to the floor. Without thinking, Matteo threw himself over Natalie. Glass exploded around them. She felt his body absorb the impact as fragments rained across the cabin. Their faces ended up inches apart. For one suspended heartbeat, everything became silent. She saw exhaustion behind his eyes, loneliness, pain. A man who had forgotten what peace looked like. He whispered, "Stay behind me." Her voice barely escaped. "You'll get yourself killed." He smiled faintly. "I've been trying not to, ever since I met you." The words caught her completely off guard. Not a confession. Not yet. But something had changed. Neither of them could deny it. A violent explosion shook the entire aircraft. The left wing caught fire. Emergency alarms blared throughout the cabin. Smoke began pouring through the ventilation system. The plane would not remain safe much longer. Captain Collins stared through the cockpit windows. Horror filled his face. "No." Matteo turned sharply. "What happened?" The captain whispered. "They're not trying to board anymore. They're trying His voice broke. To destroy the plane. Outside, several black armored SUVs burst through the airport security barricades. More than 20 heavily armed men spread across the runway. At their center, a tall man stepped from a black Rolls-Royce Phantom. Perfectly tailored, charcoal overcoat, silver hair, black leather gloves, no weapon visible. He simply looked up at Flight 728, then smiled. Matteo's face went completely still. Natalie had never seen fear in him before. Until now, he spoke only one name. Victor. Natalie looked at him. That's Moretti? Matteo nodded slowly. The man who started every war has finally come to finish this one. Victor Moretti raised a small radio to his mouth. The aircraft speakers crackled to life one final time. His calm voice echoed through the burning cabin. Good evening, Matteo. I've spent 10 years trying to kill you. He paused. Then his tone became almost amused. But now, I've discovered something far more interesting. Another pause. Natalie instinctively gripped Matteo's hand. Victor chuckled. I don't want your empire anymore. I want the flight attendant. Matteo's entire body froze. Victor's final words sent a chill through every soul aboard. Flight 728. Bring Natalie Ross to me, and every other passenger walks away alive. 1 year later, the world had finally stopped talking about Flight 728. News channels moved on. Politicians denied everything. Several high-ranking officials quietly disappeared into federal custody. The Moretti syndicate collapsed within weeks of Victor Moretti's death. Hundreds of shell companies were dismantled. Billions of dollars in criminal assets were seized. For the first time in decades, one of America's oldest mafia empires had simply ceased to exist. Not because someone conquered it, because one man chose to end it. Matteo DeLuca stood alone on the rooftop of a 30-story building overlooking downtown Chicago. The city shimmered beneath the evening sky. For years, every rooftop had represented strategy, power, territory. Tonight, it simply looked beautiful. Marco stepped beside him. The last warehouse was sold this morning. Matteo nodded silently. The casinos? Closed. The ports? Transferred to federal receivers. The accounts? Gone. Marco smiled faintly. You actually did it. Matteo looked toward the horizon. I promised my father I'd never let another generation inherit this life. Marco laughed softly. You also promised you'd never fall in love. Matteo remained silent. Some promises were worth breaking. Across the city, Natalie Ross prepared another flight. Her uniform looked exactly the same. Her smile looked almost the same. But she had changed. The nightmares came less often. She no longer jumped whenever airport security approached. Still, every time she walked through an aircraft door, she instinctively looked over every passenger, searching. Without admitting it, she hoped to see one familiar face. She never did. Matteo had disappeared 6 months earlier, not because he stopped loving her, because he believed she deserved a life untouched by violence. He refused to let the woman who had saved hundreds of strangers become another prisoner of his past. So he walked away without asking her opinion. It was the only decision of his life Natalie truly hated. One rainy afternoon, Natalie finished Flight 417 from Seattle. Passengers slowly exited. A little girl stopped beside her. You have pretty wings. Natalie smiled. Thank you. The child handed her a folded paper airplane. My dad said to give this to the nicest flight attendant. Before Natalie could ask another question, the little girl had already disappeared into the terminal. Curious, Natalie unfolded the paper airplane. Inside, a single sentence. You once hid a stranger. Would you recognize him if he asked for another chance? No signature. She didn't need one. Her heartbeat answered before her mind did. She ran, past the baggage claim, past the coffee shops, past customs, ignoring confused passengers, ignoring airport announcements. Her instincts carried her toward the old observation deck, overlooking the runways, the place where they had spoken for the last time. Rain fell gently across the glass walls, and there he was, standing exactly where she'd imagined him 100 times. Dark charcoal overcoat, hands in his pockets, watching airplanes take off. As though they still fascinated him, he turned before she spoke. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. Not yet. Too much had happened. Too much remained unsaid. Natalie stopped only a few feet away. You disappeared. I know. You promised nothing. I know. You didn't even say goodbye. Matteo lowered his eyes. I didn't think I deserved one. Silence settled between them. Finally, Natalie asked the question that had lived inside her for months. Why? He looked out across the rain-covered runway. Because every person I've ever loved ended up paying for my mistakes. I thought leaving would protect you. Natalie stepped closer. You still don't understand. He frowned slightly. I never needed protection from loving you. I needed protection from losing you. For the first time since they'd met, Matteo had no answer. Natalie gently took his hand, the same hand that had shielded her from bullets, pulled her through burning wreckage, held her whenever fear became too heavy to carry alone. You spent your whole life deciding for other people. She smiled softly. Maybe it's time you let someone choose you. The words broke the last wall he'd spent years building. Slowly, he intertwined his fingers with hers. I don't know how to be ordinary. She laughed quietly. Neither do I. We'll learn. Together. Several months later. The wedding wasn't held inside a luxury hotel, nor a cathedral guarded by armed men. It took place inside a restored aircraft museum overlooking Lake Michigan. The first airplane Natalie had ever worked aboard rested quietly behind the ceremony. White flowers decorated the old runway. Former flight attendants filled the front rows. Marco stood proudly as Matteo's best man. Captain Henry Collins attended with his daughter, now fully recovered after successful treatment. He never stopped apologizing. Matteo never asked him to. Some debts could only be repaid by living differently. Natalie walked down the aisle, wearing an elegant ivory gown. There were no photographers, no politicians, no criminal associates, only family, only friends, only people who had survived. When she reached Matteo, neither could stop smiling. The officiant looked between them. What is marriage, if not choosing the same person every single day? Matteo answered first. I choose her. Without hesitation, without fear, Natalie looked into his eyes. The safest place I've ever been was behind the man everyone else feared. A few guests quietly wiped away tears. Marco looked suspiciously toward the ceiling. I'm not crying. It's the wind. Everyone laughed, even Matteo, perhaps for the first time in years. His laughter carried no sadness behind it. After the ceremony, the sun slowly disappeared beyond Lake Michigan. Guests released white paper airplanes into the evening sky. Each carried a handwritten wish. One be one. The tiny planes floated across the lake. Natalie watched them silently, then smiled. Do you remember the first thing you ever asked me? Matteo nodded. I asked you not to tell anyone I was there. She laughed. And now? He looked toward the endless sky filled with departing aircraft. Now, I hope the whole world knows exactly where I belong. He reached into his jacket. Natalie raised an eyebrow. Another secret? He smiled. No. A boarding pass. She looked down. Passenger name. Matteo DeLuca. Destination. Anywhere you go. Tears immediately filled her eyes. You really kept it. I've carried it every day. She wrapped her arms around him. No more running. No more hiding. He rested his forehead gently against hers. No more goodbyes. As another aircraft climbed into the evening sky, Natalie realized something beautiful. She had spent years believing airplanes existed to carry strangers from one destination to another. She finally understood they could do something far greater. Sometimes, a single flight could carry two broken souls toward the life they were always meant to find. What began as an emergency landing ended as a journey home, not because they escaped danger, but because they discovered that home was never an airport, never a city, never a mansion. Home was simply the person who would still be standing beside you after the storm had finally passed.